Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys some brand new track reviews for some recently released tracks that I just happen to hear and have some opinions on. So with all of that said, let's just get right into it with the first track I want to talk about here today, this new single from Marianas Trench, Echoes of You. Now, Marianas Trench, with some of the previous singles that they've dropped for their upcoming album, my opinions have been kind of, mixed overall, I guess you could say. I thought the track I Knew You When was a pretty underwhelming pop track that really didn't do all too much for me, but I thought the last single they dropped from the album that I talked about on my last track review segment, Only the Lonely Survive, was a pretty solid cut overall. However, I was still a little bit concerned for the upcoming album because I just felt like based on those couple of tracks that they weren't anywhere really near as, adventurous sounding, I guess you could say, as a lot of Marianas Trench's best material. And considering the fact that I really like the adventurous yet poppy sound that the band has going for them, it's kind of a shame if they were to release an album that really was lacking in that really grand, adventurous feel. However, fortunately, this new track is really what I would expect from Marianas Trench on a song. It has that very poppy sound to it. However, there's also a lot of experimentation and just very interesting things packed into this track as well. I like how there's various different sounding segments here on this track. It reminds me of some of the more large and adventurous cuts from Astoria. And I'm just really hoping that this new upcoming album from them has more cuts like this than I Knew You When. But this track alone, definitely a pretty great one overall. I like a lot of what the band is doing here on this one. It keeps that poppy, catchy sound that I love about this group, but at the same time has that very adventurous sound that I also really enjoy. So if you're a fan of pop rock, make sure you check this track out. Moving on though, let's talk about the new collaborative track between Beck, Robyn, and The Lonely Island for the new Lego movie. Haven't seen the movie, so I can't comment on that, but I will say that this is a pretty eclectic track overall, from the artist featured on it being from a wide array of different sounds to the fact that it's, of course, tied to a Lego movie, pretty much. And, this track has a lot of interesting things going for it, but I don't really feel like it comes together as nicely as it could have. And I feel like that's mostly because there's just a lot going on here on this track, and none of it really sticks together all that nicely. The instrumental to this track is this very cool sounding, funky piece of instrumentation that's pretty decent overall. It's probably the most consistently enjoyable aspect of the track. I think it's pretty okay overall. Beck and Robyn's performance on this thing is also pretty okay. It's not super memorable or anything, but it's fine as it is, I guess. My least favorite part of this track overall is the Lonely Islands part on the track, which is just not really all that funny, I guess, even though it's trying to be funny. I don't mean it's not funny because, it's trying too hard necessarily, or because it's in bad taste or something like that. It's not funny just because the jokes aren't really funny at all. I have a hard time imagining that anyone listening to this would find it funny, because it wasn't even really bringing a smile to my face. Really, they're just rapping about the credits and how they're excited for the credits, to read stuff during the credits, and that's the joke pretty much. The fact that they're excited for the credits. It's not really funny, at all. I have a hard time imagining, like I just said, that anyone would really find it all that funny. And it kind of ruins a good portion of this track, just because there's a good stretch of this track where they're just going on about the credits, but there really is no payoff to it. There's no moment where the joke kind of comes together and it becomes really funny, or it recontextualizes previous parts that maybe weren't as funny, but looking back on them after you know the entirety of what they're going for, it becomes funnier. It's just not funny at all. And I get that this is for a kids movie, so they probably weren't trying to do anything too raunchy or anything like that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have to not be funny or anything. I mean, kids have a sense of humor too. I mean, I haven't seen this new Lego movie, but I saw the first one back when that came out, and it was decently funny from what I remember, so, there's no excuse really for why this couldn't be at least more funny than it is in its current state. Overall, this track, just has a lot of different stuff going on in it. It doesn't really click together all that nicely. Feels like a bit of a mess, which is kind of a disappointment, because I do feel like this could have been a bit better than it actually was if, maybe a few things in the track were changed up slightly. But yeah, overall, wasn't feeling this one all too much. Moving on, we're going to be talking about the new track from Dream Theater, Paralyzed from their new upcoming album, which I do hope to review on the channel at some point in the near future. Overall, this track is a pretty decent track overall. I don't really have too many strong opinions about this track. It's just kind of alright. The track is performed solidly enough. I think it comes together in a way that's pretty exciting to listen to. It is a shorter track, at least by Dream Theater standards, and it is a pretty breezy listen as well, a bit more accessible of a track, if you will, and it still manages to sound pretty entertaining despite all that. I will say I'm not the biggest fan of the hook on the track. I do feel like, I'm not sure, the vocals on it sound really odd. Maybe they're manipulated in some way. They just feel kind of hollow and echoey. Not sure why. Maybe that is just how they're naturally supposed to sound and I'm overthinking it, but they did sound a bit off to me. I'm not really sure why, which is kind of a shame because I do think the chorus of this track is at least catchy, and I feel like if the vocal performance on it was a bit better, it would have made this chorus, just hit a bit harder, which I think would have made the track better overall. But yeah, this is just a pretty decent track at the end of the day. It's not one that I'm loving or anything like that, but it's not one that I dislike either. I just do hope that at least some of the tracks from this new upcoming album are a bit more exciting than this one, because this one just feels a bit safe overall, I guess you could say. But yeah, not a bad track by any means. It's alright. Next up, we have this new track from Gerard featuring Toro, their cover of Happy Together. It's kind of funny that, these guys dropped a cover of Hazy Shade of Winter a couple weeks ago that I did cover on this segment also, and in that segment I did say that I liked the fact that on that track they were able to take this older song and kind of twist it to be more of their own and have it still be exciting and new, and I kind of compared it to some of the tracks from that new Weezer Teal album and said that it was more exciting or interesting and just unique than any of the tracks on that album were. Funny enough, a couple weeks later, Gerard and Toro decided to drop another cover track, which happened to be a track that was also covered on that Weezer Teal album. I mean, it's not super important when it comes to my actual opinions on this cover, but I just thought that was funny. But when it comes to my actual thoughts on this cover, I'm a lot less impressed with this cover than I was with the last cover that these two dropped a couple weeks ago. This one just feels a lot more typical, a lot more plain overall, I guess you could say. I mean, it's not a terrible cover by any means. It's decent enough. The performances across this thing are pretty fine throughout. However, it's just not as exciting of a track. I don't feel like they take this track and do as much with it as they did with the last cover that they did. I don't feel like they make it their own as much as they did with that last cover of theirs. This is just a pretty okay cover song overall. It's not one that I really feel excited to revisit in the future, but it's not one that I would be against listening to again either. This track is also being tied with that Netflix series based on one of Gerard comic works that's coming out soon in the future, like that last cover was. Not sure if these two covers are going to be tied in any important way to the series, or if they're just, just pieces of music, tied to it for the sake of having something tied to it. But overall, I guess if you're a fan of these two, give this a listen. Maybe you'll enjoy it more than I did, but I just thought it was kind of unimportant, really, at the end of the day. And given that I really do love these two, and the fact that they're collaborating together again on a track is something that should be pretty exciting, the end result is just kind of there. It's not all that exciting. Next up, we're going to be talking about the new Royce the 5'9" track. I was pretty, big on Royce's last album he dropped last year, Book of Ryan. Thought it was a pretty solid project overall. And, I was pretty excited to hear that he dropped a new track here. I'm not sure if this is going to be on some upcoming project or anything, or if it's just a loose track. But overall, my opinions on this track are pretty mixed at the end of the day. Royce's rapping on this track is pretty solid overall. He's always been a pretty great rapper, and he definitely still showcases it here on this track. The beat on this track is also pretty decent as well. I feel like it matches up pretty nicely with the overall tone of this track. It was also produced by Royce himself, and I feel like that may be why it just matches up very nicely with the feel of, the verses and every other aspect of this track. Really all comes together in a way that feels really solid and cohesive. The lyrics here on the track are the first major point of the song overall where I feel like it's a bit hit or miss. On one hand, I do like a lot of what he talks about here in regards to racism and things of that sort. He talks a lot about Kaepernick and kneeling in regards to football and all that, which I thought was pretty interesting and well done, pretty captivating too. But there's also other moments on the lyrics here that I just feel like either just aren't as interesting or a bit off topic, or just completely undermine some of the other issues talked about in the song. For example, there's one part where he's kind of talking about how he doesn't need, to be respected by critics and bloggers and all that. And then there's one part where he calls award shows, gay-ass award shows or something along those lines. Which, if you're going to make a song talking about racism and talk about one of the most, oppressed groups in American history, probably not a good idea to use a term that's, offensive to another one of the more oppressed groups in American history. Kind of undermines the overall message of the song. And at the same time, in regards to that line in a more general context, there was a whole song off of his last album, Book of Ryan, that was about award shows and all of that. Was a lot more interesting, a lot better done overall, I'd say. This just kind of feels like a leftover of that, and it's just not that good overall. I do also feel like the track at times feels a little bit bloated and just goes on for a bit too long, and there's just certain moments in here where I feel like, as I said before, the lyrics just aren't as substance-filled as some of the other moments, and I feel like could be easily cut out or replaced by something a bit more interesting to keep the track a bit more lively overall. So yeah, I have kind of mixed opinions on this track overall. Honestly, it's not a track that I see myself coming back to all that much, even though I do feel like Royce's performance in regards to his rapping on this track and the production is pretty okay overall. The lyrics are just hit or miss for me at times, and given that this is a lyrically dense track, if the lyrics don't, completely hit on this song, it's not gonna really stay in rotation for me all that much. So yeah, have pretty mixed feelings on this track. Alright, the last two tracks I need to talk about here today are actually just alternate versions of pre-existing tracks. The first one is an alternate version of the 21 Pilots song Chlorine that recently dropped. The original version of the song coming from their last studio album Trench that came out last year. Overall, I was pretty indifferent to that album. I mean, I thought it was decent, but I didn't like it nearly as much as I was hoping I was going to like it. But I do feel like Chlorine was one of the better tracks off of that album. However, I'm even happier to say that I actually like this new alternative version of the track even more than the original. This version of the track is overall just a bit faster sounding. It's a bit more concise as well. It just feels a lot more to the point, I guess you could say. And I just feel like it is greatly improved by being a bit more to the point overall. I just found myself enjoying this version of the track a lot more than the original, even though I like the original a fair amount as well. I mean, I wouldn't say that there's a drastic difference between these two, with the exception of the runtime, but still, I just think that this one is a bit more concise overall, and I like it more as a result of that. But still, it's not the most essential thing to listen to if you're a 21 Pilots fan or anything like that. It really is just a slightly different version of the song that they already dropped a while ago at this point, but it's not a bad alternate version by any means. And also, whatever that is on the cover art for this single, whatever that porg-looking thing is, I don't know what it is, but I want to give that thing like a 10 out of 10, because it's perfect in every way. And finally, the last one I want to talk about is the new acoustic version of the Maine song Numb Without You, the original version of this track being dropped a couple weeks ago as the lead single for their upcoming album that comes out later this year in March. I like the original track overall. I was pretty positive towards it. And this acoustic version of the track is pretty okay overall, I guess. I'm really not as wowed with this version of the track as I was the original, just because I feel like this track, the best qualities of this track at least don't translate all that nicely into an acoustic version. Like, for example, one thing I really liked about the original were some of the strings incorporated into it and just some of those more out there elements. Those are completely lost, of course, in translation to the acoustic version, given that the acoustic is supposed to be, stripped back, very intimate and personal sounding, so it loses all of that, but in the process it loses some of those things that I just thought were really interesting about the song. Overall, when it's all stripped back of all that stuff, it just becomes a pretty typical pop rock song, which is by no means a terrible thing, but it definitely does make the track a lot less memorable overall. I will say the acoustic, performances on this thing are pretty solid overall. I will say the vocals on this thing are a bit hit or miss as well. I feel like the vocal performance on this version of the track isn't as strong as it could have been, and that's another thing that kind of keeps me from enjoying this track as much as the original. But still, this is a just pretty standard acoustic version of a song, really. Like, it's pretty much what you expect walking into it. It makes for a pretty pleasant listen, but at the same time, it's nowhere near as exciting or interesting as the original track, just because it loses a lot of what made the original track as interesting as it was in translation. I feel like this wasn't necessarily the best track ever to translate into, an acoustic cover. but I do feel like, you know, at the very least, that this version is competent. But with all that said, that concludes this week's track review segment. These are just my own personal opinions regarding these tracks. If you happen to have different opinions, if you happen to disagree with any of mine or agree with mine, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own opinion in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. I will say that if there are any tracks on here that are singles to upcoming albums, I am likely going to be covering those albums whenever they drop in the future. So if you want to hear my full thoughts on those, make sure you subscribe especially. Thank you once again for watching, and stay golden.